God's gonna lift him again.
To start off, I bet many of you, even the ones from Bakersfield, don't know that Buck Owens' first name was actually Alvis. You can look it up. It was Alvis Edgar Owens Jr. And you probably didn't know there's a famous English car called the Alvis. Here's a picture. Check out that logo, huh? But the best part is what the word Alvis actually means. Turns out it's a Scandinavian word that means all wise. Huh, well how about that? I wonder if Buck knew what his real first name meant. I bet his dad knew the score. So this show isn't about Alvis Buck Owens, no. And it isn't about the Alvis vintage car either, even though we will be talking quite a bit about cars. I guess you could call this an Alvis car because this is my car and my name is Mark Alvis. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing. Everyone has a different version. For some, it's their family. For others, it's their art, like music or painting. Or maybe it's waking up on a crystal clear morning and watching the sunrise. It can take a lot of time to figure out exactly what your most important thing actually is. I know for me there isn't a simple answer, like riding my bike or enjoying a fine craft beer at the Tap and Cellar. Yes, biking and beer greatly enhance my life, and I wouldn't want to live without them, but they're not singularly the top dog. When I get down to it and really think about the most important thing, it usually comes out something like life in connection with the universe. You could reduce this down to the elements that make up life, like water and air and carbon, and the things that make up the universe, space and stars and such. But it's really the combination of these things where my thoughts always land. Yes, maybe the universe would still exist without life, but who would care? When we think about all the terrible things going on in the world right now, it's pretty easy to get depressed. And depression, whatever the cause, is as deadly as any other disease, and we need to face it. We're going to get to that. But first, I want to talk about some of the absolutely incredible things people are doing in the world today to make it a better place. So right off the bat, I want to recommend Paul Hawken's book, Drawdown. If you're feeling that all the news is bad and that everything's just going to hell, I think reading this book will help. It isn't religious or anything. It is a little bit technical, and I've been told not to get too sciencey, so I promise to be gentle. So where does that leave us? We are definitely at the point where it is imperative that everyone understands what's going on with the climate. To do that, we have to understand some science. I know this may cause anxiety for some, as we're not all born to be chemists. I think of it like this. Science is really just our way of trying to understand nature. As humans, we are part of nature. Most of us like being in nature, hiking in the mountains or maybe strolling by the ocean. Okay, maybe we don't quite get how climate change leads to the acidification of the ocean, but we can see that it is harming the coral reefs and melting the permafrost. We may not understand everything about science, but that doesn't mean we should be afraid of it. One reaction to this is to treat people like they don't want to know about science because it turns them off. So, because TV wants people to be watching, of course, they generally insist on making it easy to understand. Similarly, the internet often focuses on how many hits a particular post gets. Something going viral means that millions of people have clicked on it, whether it is a positive thing or a horrible thing. Where does this lead us in the long run? We really need to ask, if we treat people like they're stupid, will that make them any smarter? Combined, TV and the internet have the ability to communicate and educate on a level we've never seen before. We need to use these abilities to do just that. I talked to Ann at the house my cousin Cameron had just finished building in Santa Rosa. The house is in Coffey Park, where 1,400 homes burned down in the Tubbs fire. Cameron designed and built the house following the advanced energy standards Ann teaches in her classes.
Can energy efficiency fix climate change? Not alone. I think it's a big piece of it. You know, buildings are 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so with efficiency, we can reduce those emissions dramatically, arguably in some circumstances down to zero or even positive emissions if we use carbon sequestering materials, for example. But we have a whole huge array of existing buildings that we need to reduce the emissions from. And that's a bigger challenge than, say, building a new building to a zero emissions standard.
Building a new building energy efficient wise would be easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, you start from scratch and you don't have to undo and redo. There are carbon costs to everything we do, right? Everything we touch, move, harvest, manufacture. And so if you're taking products or materials or systems out of a home in order to replace them with new products and systems, that's going to have a higher impact, even if your operational emissions are zero at the end of that retrofitting process. There's some carbon cost to it. Of course, that's also true with new construction. So we have to be more attentive, even more attentive, because we're looking at more products and systems. But we have fewer problems in creating an efficient building when we start from scratch. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having above code insulation and paying attention to air sealing, so we're not heating a space and then leaking that heat out to the exterior in the winter, or likewise cooling in summer, makes an enormous difference. The most important thing is the building enclosure. So the walls, the roof, the floors, the windows. That's the most important thing. So it means that there's no operating carbon in the house. So, right. So,
gas.
right. Yeah. No fossil fuels that are used in the home at all. I think the most important thing is that we protect our families, right? Now and into the future. And the biggest threat we are currently facing is climate change. So that's where my focus is.
Yeah. So what you're doing is directly benefiting that, needless to say.
I certainly hope so. That's the plan. That's what I get up every day trying to do. Well, I think Mother Nature is doing quite a lot to communicate that message right now. Certainly here in Northern California, but elsewhere as well. We are not the region that is unique in being dealt our share of disasters and tragedies as a result of climate change combined with other forces of nature and humans to bring those disasters. And I think connecting the dots means having people understand more directly the relationship between the decisions they make about the built environment and climate change, and also about the influence they have on those decisions. In Sonoma County in particular, the level of awareness is quite high on average of the connection between climate change and human activity. Probably less so specifically in the building arena, but we're getting there. For example, there are communities all over California right now that are hearing REACH codes, which are essentially regulatory measures that would allow those communities to have higher standards for energy efficiency than the state requires as a minimum. And the reason they're looking at those REACH codes is typically climate emergency. And many communities are also enacting climate emergency ordinances. the deal with natural gas is that you may be aware that before leaving office, Governor Brown enacted a bunch of legislative measures. And one of the things was we're going to have a climate neutral grid, so all 100% clean energy from renewables by 2045. And then he also said we're going to have a climate neutral economy. So economy-wide, zero emissions by 2045. Well, a climate neutral grid gets us partway there, but it omits natural gas combustion, right? Because the grid is how we produce and deliver electricity, but it doesn't speak to our fossil fuel combustion. Whereas a carbon neutral economy means, oh, we have to address fossil fuel combustion too, essentially making it go away, right? Because fossil fuel combustion represents about 40% of our emissions. So that's a very big deal. And of course, a lot of our fossil fuel combustion happens, ta-da, in buildings. Most of the fossil fuel combustion is for space heating and water heating. But of course, in commercial, industrial, educational, lab facilities, there are some other uses as well. And some of those ultimately can be met through renewable natural gas, but only a small fraction of what we need society-wide. So that means we really need to eliminate the vast majority of the more routine uses where we have really great technologies to replace those fossil fuel uses. And so heating and cooling our buildings and heating water can easily be done with electric alternatives, whereas some of the other industrial uses in particular are a little more problematic. So we're going to need to reserve such renewable natural gas resources as we have for those more specialized uses. That's a great question. I really think that in many cases I'm speaking to the choir. And so many of my audiences are well informed about the impacts of the built environment, not always so well informed about really how easy it is to, from a technical perspective, to do better. I think the bigger challenges we face in this industry are not technical. They're largely cultural, institutional. In other words, they're people problems. They're not technology problems. So one of the things that I tend to talk quite a bit about is the people problems and how we try to address those. Because
that's stuck in our way.
Yeah. Yeah, we tend to be stuck in our ways. And one of the interesting factoids is the building industry, and particularly the residential building industry, has the lowest rate of investment in R&D, research and development, of pretty much any industry in North America. And so what that tells you is we don't take to innovation terribly readily. So it's more challenging in our industry to create change than it is in many other industries. We also have a very mobile workforce. It's a very fragmented workforce as opposed to a big centralized machine where people receive comparable training across the country. That is no way, no how the landscape in which we operate. We operate in a very parochial system where people learn on the job, and it's very much a culture that is handed down from individual to individual and generation to generation. So it's very hard to penetrate that culture with new ideas and new practices. So some of the technically least mysterious stuff is some of the worst done in our industry. So first of all, until very recently, nobody really even heard about or talked about air sealing a building. And even now, where there's a much higher level of understanding, like, oh yeah, it might be a good idea to have the air that comes in our house come from known places in known quantities and known quality. Whereas in the past, it was like, air gets in buildings. We got stuff to breathe, we're good, right? So there was a big gap there. Now there's more understanding. And yet we still don't actually have a trade whose responsibility it is to do air sealing in buildings, even though that can reduce our energy consumption tremendously, easily 10, 15, 20, maybe 30, maybe even 40% as compared to conventional construction. But it's nobody's responsibility. So that's a cultural and institutional hurdle. And one of the really fascinating and hardening things that I'm seeing from my vantage point in the industry right now, the industry, I say broadly, because what's happening is in the building industry, we are starting to more and more engage with the energy industry, so the utility industry. So there's a huge push right now for microgrids. And the idea of the microgrid is it's a subset of the larger grid that has within it distributed energy resources, meaning renewable energy production facilities and also energy storage facilities. And of course, a bunch of sophisticated controls and management features and so forth. And the idea is that these smaller segments or modules within the larger grid can, to some extent, be self-sufficient. And so, for example, in a power outage, such as we experienced very recently here in Sonoma County, that the power outage would not have to be nearly as widespread. It could be much more targeted because it won't be, oh my gosh, we've got to take this whole swath out all at once. We can say, we can take this part out. Oh, and by the way, and this part, when we take it out of the larger grid, it will be able to function unto itself. Right now, all we see is big institutions asking for more money and go, it already costs so much to live here. We can't afford that, right? We have this sense of we can't afford. So, but we afford all kinds of things. The big utilities around here, the big utility, the major one, is Pacific Gas and Electric. And PG&E is very aware of these issues, painfully aware, I should say, right now. And they are quite engaged in the conversations about microgrids. They're a little too busy, literally and figuratively, fighting fires at the moment, but there is definitely a backroom conversation going on involving PG&E and other major stakeholders in the area and beyond. This conversation is happening all over the country. Well, and in fact, to kind of come around full circle to where we started talking about efficiency, energy efficiency is the bedrock of every grid innovation, because besides everything else we do, we need to reduce demand. That's going to make it so much easier to meet all of our energy needs if we have lower demand everywhere. Yeah, I think it was really more a case of blindness or ignorance when we were growing up, that we were acculturated to use more energy. It wasn't so much use more energy, it was we grew up in this post-World War II era of increasing plenty and prosperity and stuff, right? We got to have more stuff. I can remember being a teenager and saving up money for the stereo and various other goodies. Stuff, yeah. So, and a lot of the stuff had energy costs attached to it. Well, as I said earlier, pretty much everything, every object, every activity we engage in almost has some sort of energy price. So, well, yeah, I mean, Greta's my hero. I think she is stunningly effective. And I actually did a really fun exercise with a group in Portland recently at a conference. And it was all about fear. And I used an image of Greta and I said, Greta says that her superpower is autism. It's not. Her superpower is fearlessness. Obviously, she's afraid of climate change, but she's fearless in, I think, what all of us need to cultivate more fearlessness around, which is how we appear to others. She doesn't care what people think of her, right? Greta is she is as effective as she is because of her fearlessness. And so I think that to me is the key takeaway. Why could she do what nobody else could do, right? It's because she wasn't afraid of those responses. And so we can't be Greta. We're not all autistic. But I think we can be more aware of how those fears get in our way and how they are at play with the folks that we interact with. Intellectual knowledge is one thing, but it doesn't compete with habit, right? It's like we all know how often we're supposed to floss our teeth or whatever it is, or exercise, but then there's habit. And habit tends to win. I believe that the most effective motivator is we all need to put our hearts on our sleeve. Because when you speak from the heart, people can respond from the heart. Technology's great, features are great, benefits are great, but most important is for us to say, I do what I do because I want my son to have a decent life. I would like him to feel that he can have children and give them a decent life. Right now, he's kind of on the fence about that. He's 20. He said, I'd like to have kids, but I want to know that the world is going to be a good place for them. It's kind of heartbreaking. So that's the heart story.
When I first heard about induction stoves, I really didn't know what they were. I knew it was an electric stove. Ann told me about it. I was at Cam's house and he told me about it. And then I decided, since I needed a new stove anyway, to go ahead and get an induction stove. One of the benefits of the induction stove is it's actually, as far as boiling water or getting hot, it's faster than gas even. It's the fastest of all the stoves you can probably get. So there's a side benefit in going all electric. If you're not used to induction, it's a bit of a learning curve, but I've had it now for a couple of months and I really am liking it. One of the reasons that we're doing all electric is to reduce the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So if I'm using my gas stove, which I removed, it burns gas just like my water heater did, my old water heater, my furnace, and my dryer. So eventually I'm going to remove all of come in and take a look at that. That's how fast it goes. Eventually I'm going to get rid of all of the gas devices in my house and go all electric. The other benefit is if you have solar in your house, you can get to the point where you make as much power as your house uses. Literally, you're going to be able to power your house just with solar. So there you go. One of the things you do need to know about an induction stove is that it requires using a certain kind of pan, a ferrous pan. So a cast iron pan like this one, or the stainless steel pan, those will both work. Easy way to tell, if you have a refrigerator magnet like that, you can just stick it to it, and if it holds it, it means the pan is ferrous or iron, steel. It means that it will work on an induction stove.